This is not night vision. It is not a grainy trail camera image or a blurry screenshot pulled from a shaky handheld video. What just came out of Skinwalker Ranch is clear, daylight clear. The kind of clear that removes every argument that has ever been made about ambiguous evidence and replaces it with something that has to be looked at directly and answered directly. No filters, no enhancement, no excuses. This footage just came out and the conversation it is starting cannot be stopped. Subscribe and watch every second. There is a specific and well-established pattern to the visual evidence that Skinwalker Ranch produces and that the investigation has been documenting across its broadcast seasons. The pattern is one of partial resolution, footage that captures something real and anomalous, but that captures it at a distance, in conditions of reduced light, through camera systems whose sensitivity is being pushed to its operational limits in order to detect phenomenon that the ranch's active zones produce at the boundary of what any instrument can cleanly document. This pattern is not accidental, and it is not a production choice. It reflects the genuine operational reality of documenting phenomenon at a location whose most significant activity occurs at night, at altitude, underground, or in conditions that the investigation's monitoring infrastructure was not specifically designed to capture. Every thermal hit from the Mesa zone that the broadcast episodes have shown has been a heat signature resolved at the limit of the camera's range. Every aerial object tracked above the property has been documented at distances where the resolution of even the most sophisticated tracking systems produces imagery that the skeptical viewer can point at and describe as ambiguous. Every underground instrument reading has been a number on a screen rather than a visual document of what generated the number. That is the visual record the investigation has accumulated across its seasons. Extraordinary in its evidential significance, limited in its visual clarity, and consistently vulnerable to the ambiguity arguments that the skeptical community has applied to it with a persistence that the investigation's instrument data has never been able to fully overcome in the court of public opinion. The footage that just came out is different from that record in a way that cannot be overstated. It is different not in the category of phenomenon it documents. The phenomenon is consistent with what the investigation has been tracking across its seasons. It is different in the clarity with which it documents it. Whatever the cameras captured in this footage was captured in conditions that produced resolution the prior investigation record has never achieved. The object is visible. Its characteristics are documentable. Its behavior during the period the cameras tracked it is recorded with a precision that the prior footage record has not produced. And the clarity of what is visible in the footage is what makes it the most significant piece of visual evidence the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has ever produced. Because clarity is the one thing the skeptical argument has never had to genuinely contend with before, it has to contend with it now. The footage did not come from a scheduled night investigation session. It did not come from a targeted deployment of monitoring equipment at a specific active zone based on prior instrument data. It came from a routine morning equipment check, a standard operational procedure in the investigation's monitoring infrastructure, in which team members conduct a physical inspection of the camera systems and sensor arrays positioned across the property to verify that the overnight recording sessions have logged correctly and that the equipment is functioning within its operational parameters. The morning was clear. Visibility across the property was unrestricted by the atmospheric conditions that frequently complicate the investigation's daytime documentation efforts. The ground fog that settles in the lower sections of the property overnight was already burning off by the time the team began the equipment check, and the light quality across the mesa and the surrounding terrain was the kind of flat, even daylight illumination that camera systems produce their cleanest imagery under. Nobody was looking for anything. That is the detail that the team members who were present that morning have consistently emphasized in the accounts they have given of the circumstances of the capture, the absolute ordinariness of what they were doing when the cameras caught what they caught. The equipment check had been proceeding through its standard sequence when the camera operator covering the northern sector of the property noticed something in the live feed from one of the fixed monitoring units positioned on the elevated terrain above the homestead area. The object was not subtle. It was not the kind of peripheral movement or marginal reading that the investigation's experienced team members have learned to assess carefully before flagging as potentially significant. It was there, in the frame, in the middle of the frame, in conditions of full daylight visibility with the camera system operating within its normal parameters and the recording infrastructure logging continuously. The operator called it immediately. By the time the second team member reached the monitoring station and confirmed what the live feed was showing, the recording had already captured the first 40 seconds of what would become the clearest piece of anomalous visual evidence the Skinwalker Ranch investigation has ever produced. What happened in the next 4 minutes and change is what the footage documents. And what the footage documents in those 4 minutes is what the rest of this video is going to break down completely. The object visible in the Skinwalker Ranch footage appears in the frame at the upper left quadrant of the camera's field of view and moves through the frame across the full duration of the recorded sequence, 4 minutes and 38 seconds from first appearance to the point at which the object exits the camera's coverage area. This description sounds straightforward. What makes it significant is what the frame-by-frame analysis of that movement produces in terms of the object's characteristics, its behavior, and the specific relationship between its documented properties and every conventional explanation that the analysis process applied to it. The object's dimensions are the first characteristic the frame-by-frame analysis establishes with clarity. It is large, not large in the ambiguous sense of a thermal return whose size is difficult to assess at distance, large in the specific and measurable sense of an object whose apparent dimensions, calculated against the known dimensions of the terrain features visible in the same frame, place it significantly outside the size range of any conventional aircraft in the civilian or known military inventory. The shape is the second characteristic the analysis documents. The object is not spherical in the way that the atmospheric plasma phenomenon or the ball lightning explanations that the skeptical community applies to similar footage would predict. It has consistent geometry across the full duration of the recording, a geometry that does not change as the object moves through the frame, does not distort in the manner of an atmospheric optical phenomenon, and does not exhibit the irregular variation that characterizes any object whose appearance is the product of light interacting with a non-solid medium. The movement is the third characteristic and the one that the analysis process found most resistant to any conventional explanation. The object's trajectory through the frame is not consistent with ballistic movement, the curved path a projectile or a falling object produces under the influence of gravity. It is not consistent with powered aerodynamic flight, the smooth curves and banked turns of a fixed-wing or rotary-wing aircraft operating within known aerodynamic constraints. It changes direction twice during the recorded sequence. Each direction change is instantaneous in the frame-by-frame record, present in one direction in one frame, present in a different direction in the next, with no transitional frames showing the arc that any conventional flight vehicle produces when changing direction. Instantaneous direction change at the velocity the object is maintaining is not aerodynamically possible for any known vehicle. The footage documents it happening twice. Travis Taylor reviewed the footage within hours of its capture. His response to the initial viewing has been documented by everyone present during the review session and described with a consistency across those independent accounts that communicates something specific about the quality of what the footage produced in a physicist whose professional career has been built around the rigorous application of scientific methodology to exactly the class of phenomenon the footage documents. Taylor did not react dramatically. That is the first and most significant thing about his response. He watched the footage through its full duration without speaking. He asked for it to be replayed. He watched it a second time. He asked a single technical question about the camera system's operational parameters during the recording, a question whose specific content reflects the systematic process of eliminating equipment artifact as a conventional explanation before engaging with the implications of what the footage shows. The answer to the question confirmed that the camera was operating within its normal parameters and that the recording infrastructure was logging correctly throughout the sequence. Taylor watched the footage a third time. Then he said 4 words that the accounts of everyone present describe with identical precision. He said, "Run the numbers." That instruction initiated the technical analysis process that produced the frame-by-frame documentation described in the prior section of this video. Taylor's direction of that analysis process across the hours that followed the initial viewing is documented in the investigation's internal record and reflects his professional commitment to establishing what the footage shows through quantitative analysis rather than qualitative impression. The velocity calculations he directed produced numbers that he has subsequently described in his careful public language as being in a range that requires explanation. The direction change analysis produced results that his physics background gives him the specific vocabulary to characterize with precision, and the characterization he has used in the limited public references he has made to the footage is the most direct statement he has made about any piece of Skinwalker Ranch evidence in his seasons on the property. He said the direction changes documented in the footage are not consistent with any propulsion system whose operating principles are represented in the current scientific literature, not inconsistent with known aircraft, not inconsistent with known atmospheric phenomena, not consistent with any propulsion system in the current scientific literature. That is a physicist with a classified defense research background telling you that what the footage shows is operating on principles his professional knowledge does not account for. The footage was submitted for independent technical analysis within 48 hours of its capture, a decision that reflected both the investigation's standard protocol for significant evidence and the specific quality of what the footage contained that made independent verification a priority rather than a procedural formality. The analysts selected for the independent review were chosen on the basis of their professional backgrounds in optical physics, aerospace engineering, and digital imaging forensics, disciplines whose combined relevance to the specific questions the footage raised made their assessments the most technically defensible available. None of the three analysts had prior engagement with the Skinwalker Ranch investigation. None of them were told the footage's origin before conducting their initial analysis. The digital imaging forensics assessment was the first to be completed and the first to address the question that every piece of anomalous footage must answer before its content can be seriously evaluated, whether the footage is authentic. The forensics assessment examined the recording's metadata, the pixel-level consistency of the object across frames, the relationship between the object's visual characteristics and the lighting environment documented in the surrounding frame, and the absence or presence of the digital artifacts that post-production compositing and CGI insertion produce in video footage at the pixel level. The assessment's conclusion was unambiguous. The footage has not been altered. The object is present in the original recording. Its visual characteristics are consistent with a physical object present in the environment when the camera was recording, rather than an element introduced into the footage after the fact. The optical physics assessment addressed the question of whether the object's visual characteristics are consistent with any known natural optical phenomenon, atmospheric optical effects, lens artifacts, light diffraction events, or any of the other conventional explanations that the skeptical literature applies to anomalous aerial footage. The conclusion was that the object's consistency across the full duration of the recording, its behavior during the two direction changes, and its dimensional relationship to the terrain features in the same frame are collectively inconsistent with any natural optical phenomenon in the reference literature. The aerospace engineering assessment addressed the question of the object's flight characteristics and produced the finding that the investigation team's own analysis had already established, that the direction changes documented in the footage are not achievable by any known aerospace vehicle operating within known aerodynamic or propulsive constraints. 3 independent analysts, 3 disciplines, 1 conclusion: what the footage shows is real and is not explicable within any conventional framework any of the 3 analysts' professional backgrounds provided. Every piece of Skinwalker Ranch evidence that preceded this footage, every thermal hit, every electromagnetic reading, every instrument anomaly and crew medical incident and underground vibration signature, was evidence of the phenomenon's effects rather than evidence of the phenomenon itself. The instruments detected what the phenomenon did to the electromagnetic environment, to the underground geological formation, to the physical bodies of the crew members who spent time in the active zones. The cameras documented the phenomenon's outputs, the light signatures, the heat signatures, the aerial objects whose visual resolution at distance left the question of their fundamental nature perpetually open. What the clear footage provides that none of the prior evidence provided is a direct visual record of the phenomenon at a resolution sufficient to document its intrinsic characteristics rather than just its effects. And what those intrinsic characteristics? The object's consistent geometry, its dimensional scale, its response to whatever environmental or investigative conditions produce the 2 direction changes, establish about the nature of the phenomenon is what makes the footage categorically different from everything the investigation has previously produced. The geometry is manufactured. That is the conclusion that the optical physics analysis forces on anyone who applies it honestly to what the footage shows. The object's shape is not the shape that natural processes produce. Natural aerial phenomena, plasma formations, ice crystal optical effects, atmospheric lensing events, do not produce objects with consistent geometric profiles that are maintained across minutes of movement through a changing atmospheric environment. The object in the footage maintains its geometry from first frame to last. That maintenance is the signature of construction rather than natural process. Something made it that shape, and the shape is being maintained actively rather than persisting passively. The scale is significant in a specific way that the prior footage record's ambiguity had prevented from being established. The object is large. Its calculated dimensions place it in a size category that raises specific questions about where it goes when it is not visible above the property. Questions whose most direct answer points at the underground formation that the investigation has been mapping beneath the mesa. An object of those dimensions transitioning from the airspace above the mesa to the underground formation beneath it would produce exactly the kind of surface and subsurface instrument signatures the investigation has been documenting across its seasons. The footage may not be new evidence of a new phenomenon. It may be the clearest visual documentation yet of the mechanism connecting the aerial activity above the ranch to the underground activity beneath it. Brandon Fugel's public response to the footage's release was made in a statement whose careful construction reflects the same quality of managed communication that has characterized every significant public disclosure he has made about the investigation across his years of ownership. The statement confirms the footage's authenticity. It confirms that the footage has been subjected to independent technical analysis, whose findings he describes in general terms consistent with what the analysis actually established. It confirms that the investigation is treating the footage as significant within the ongoing research program, and that the findings it produces will be incorporated into the investigation's accumulating evidence record. What the statement does not contain is as significant as what it does. Fugel does not characterize what the footage shows. He confirms that it shows something, and that the something has been independently verified as real and has been technically analyzed by qualified professionals. He does not go further than that. The specific restraint with which he manages the characterization question, stopping at the point of confirming reality and verified analysis without extending to any description of what the verified real thing is behavior that the audience that has followed Fugel across the investigation seasons will recognize as his standard approach to the most significant evidence the investigation produces. He manages the characterization of the most significant findings most carefully. The inverse relationship between the significance of the evidence and the specificity of his public characterization of it is a consistent pattern in his communication record that the most attentive viewers of the investigation have noted across multiple seasons. What it communicates about this footage is that it is in the highest category of significance that the investigation has produced, that what it shows is something whose direct public characterization carries implications that Fugel has determined require management rather than plain statement. The people who have been closest to Fugel during the period following the footage's capture and the subsequent analysis have described his private response to the findings with a consistency that indicates something specific about where he is in his relationship to the investigation's most recent evidence. He is not surprised. He is not unsettled in the way that unexpected evidence unsettles. He is the way a person is when something they have been anticipating for a long time has finally produced itself in a form that is no longer deniable. The footage confirmed something he already knew was there. What it confirmed, what the footage shows that Fugel's careful statement declines to characterize, is what the final sections of this video will address directly. The footage's public release produced a response from the institutional ecosystem surrounding the Skinwalker Ranch investigation that is itself significant evidence about the nature of what the footage documents. The response came quickly, faster than the ordinary tempo of institutional engagement with publicly released anomalous evidence typically produces, and it came from directions that the investigation's public profile alone does not account for. The UAP disclosure community, the network of researchers, former government officials, journalists, and congressional staffers whose professional focus is the intersection of anomalous aerial phenomenon and government transparency, engaged with the footage within hours of its release with a specificity of attention that reflects something about the footage's content beyond its general significance as Skinwalker Ranch evidence. The specific technical characteristics that the UAP disclosure community's most credible voices focused on in their assessments of the footage, the direction changes, the dimensional scale, the geometric consistency, are characteristics that the classified UAP evidence record, whose existence has been established through congressional testimony and intelligence community disclosures, apparently contains comparisons for. Former government officials whose prior public statements about UAP evidence have been specific and credible made references in their assessments of the footage to comparisons they were careful not to make explicit, references that communicated awareness of a classified evidence record whose contents correspond to what the Skinwalker Ranch footage documents without stating that correspondence directly. The congressional UAP oversight infrastructure, whose development since 2017 has produced the most significant public acknowledgement of anomalous aerial phenomenon in government history, engaged with the footage in ways that reflect institutional awareness of its significance extending beyond the paranormal television audience the investigation normally addresses. Staffers whose professional focus is UAP evidence assessment made inquiries about the footage's technical documentation package, the kind of inquiries that reflect interest in whether the evidence meets the evidentiary standard for inclusion in the classified assessment processes whose existence the congressional oversight work has established. The government's relationship to what the Skinwalker Ranch cameras have been documenting across the investigation seasons has always been the most significant and least publicly addressed dimension of the investigation's broader context. The response to this footage's release suggests that the relationship between what the investigation's cameras just documented in daylight and what the classified UAP evidence record contains is closer than the managed public distance between those two bodies of evidence has previously allowed to be acknowledged. Every prior piece of Skinwalker Ranch visual evidence has been vulnerable to one argument: ambiguity, distance, low light, instrument readings rather than images. The skeptical community has lived in that ambiguity for years, and it has been effective because the prior footage record never fully closed the door on conventional explanation. This footage closes it. What was documented above Skinwalker Ranch in full daylight by a camera operating within its normal parameters cannot be made ambiguous by distance or conditions or the limitations of night vision technology. 3 independent analysts confirmed it is real. A directed energy physicist confirmed the direction changes are not consistent with any propulsion system in the current scientific literature. Brandon Fugel confirmed its significance without characterizing what it shows, which is itself the characterization. The investigation has been asking a question for 5 seasons. The clear footage is that question being asked in a form that requires a direct answer for the first time, not an instrument reading, not a thermal signature at the limit of resolution, a clear image in daylight of something that should not be there. The answer that image demands is the conversation everything the ranch has produced has been building toward. Brandon Fugel has never locked down Skinwalker Ranch. Through 5 seasons of aerial phenomenon, underground discoveries, crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that dismantled every conventional explanation his scientific team applied to them, the gates stayed open and the investigation kept moving. Until now, scientists on the property confirmed something this week that produced a lockdown decision that nobody in the investigation's history has ever made before. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what they confirmed is the reason. Brandon Fugel's identity as the owner and driving force behind the Skinwalker Ranch investigation is built on a specific and consistent quality that has defined every season of the broadcast record: the quality of continuation. Where the Sherman family eventually left, where the NIDS program eventually wound down, where the AAWSAP initiative eventually had its funding discontinued, Fugel has kept moving. The investigation he inherited when he purchased the property from Robert Bigelow in 2016 came with a documented history of every prior program that engaged seriously with what the ranch produced, eventually reaching a point at which continuation became impossible. Whether through financial pressure, institutional resistance, personal toll, or the specific quality of exhaustion that sustained proximity to this property's phenomenon produces in the people who experience it directly. Fugel absorbed all of that prior history before he committed the resources that purchasing and operating the investigation required. He understood that every program before his had stopped. He decided that understanding was a reason to build something more durable rather than a warning to reconsider. The production framework he established, the History Channel broadcast deal, the assembly of a scientific team anchored by Travis Taylor's aerospace and defense research credentials, the continuous monitoring infrastructure that gave the investigation a surveillance presence the prior programs had never sustained, was designed specifically to outlast whatever the ranch produced. It was designed to keep moving. The seasons that followed validated that design. The investigation documented aerial phenomenon, electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, physical effects on crew members, and an escalating body of instrument data that would have ended any prior program within its first season, and that the Fugal operation absorbed, documented, and kept investigating. There was no lockdown when a crew member required medical evacuation. There was no lockdown when the drilling operation encountered resistance at depths whose correspondence to the sonar-mapped underground voids indicated the resistance was not geological. There was no lockdown when the perimeter cameras documented something approaching the property from outside the fence line in a sequence whose 4 independent data streams the investigation's technical team could not account for conventionally. Through all of it, the gates stayed open. What the scientists confirmed this week closed them, and the specific nature of what they confirmed is what makes a lockdown decision from the man who has never made one the most significant single event in the modern history of the Skinwalker Ranch investigation. The scientists whose findings produced the lockdown decision were not members of the investigation's regular research team. They were brought onto the property specifically to assess a body of data that the investigation's existing scientific infrastructure had produced across the most recent investigation phase, and that Travis Taylor had determined required external validation before any conclusions about its implications could be responsibly drawn. The decision to bring in outside assessment was itself significant. Taylor's professional standards have always been high enough that the investigation's prior anomalous findings had been subjected to rigorous internal analysis before being presented to any outside party. The fact that this specific body of data was assessed internally and then referred for external validation rather than being processed within the normal analytical pipeline indicates that what the internal analysis produced was something Taylor's scientific discipline required him to verify independently before he was willing to act on it. The outside scientists brought to the ranch represented 3 specific disciplines whose combined relevance to what the investigation's instruments had been detecting was deliberate rather than coincidental. A geophysicist whose academic background included research into unusual electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations. A physicist specializing in directed energy systems whose professional history included classified defense research programs operating in the same technical domain as several of Taylor's prior NASA projects, and a materials scientist whose laboratory had conducted independent analysis on physical samples recovered from the ranch's active zones in prior investigation phases. Samples whose compositional results had never been publicly discussed in any broadcast episode. The assessment framework the 3 outside scientists applied to the investigation's data was designed by Taylor to be as resistant to the conventional dismissal that anomalous findings at this property have historically received from outside institutions as his internal analysis methodology could make it. The instrument data was presented without its geographic and contextual provenance. The scientists assessed the readings as raw data before being told where the data was collected. What they confirmed when they reviewed that data, before they were told they were looking at Skinwalker Ranch measurements, is what produced the lockdown. The body of data that Taylor submitted to outside scientific assessment represents the accumulation of the investigation's most recent instrument readings across 3 specific measurement categories that have been the focus of the investigation's technical attention since the underground dimension of the ranch's phenomenon was established in the middle seasons of the broadcast record. The electromagnetic measurement data from the Mesa zone covers a period of continuous monitoring whose duration and whose instrument density give it a statistical foundation that single-session anomalous readings cannot claim. What that longitudinal dataset shows is not a pattern of spikes and returns to baseline, the pattern that characterizes instrument response to transient environmental events. It shows a directional movement. The baseline itself is rising. The electromagnetic environment of the Mesa zone has been measurably and consistently different from what it was at the beginning of the monitoring period, and the rate of that change has been accelerating across the most recent measurement sessions in a manner that the geophysicist brought in for the external assessment described in terms that the investigation's internal record captures with the specific quality of professional restraint that indicates a scientist choosing their words about an extraordinary finding very carefully. The underground vibration data from the drilling zone adds the second dimension of the assessment package. The vibration signatures logged by the sensors positioned at the boundaries of the underground void network have been showing a change in their structural characteristics across the recent measurement period, not in their frequency range, which has remained consistent with what the investigation established as the baseline for those sensors, but in their internal organization. The randomness metric applied to those signatures has been declining. The patterns they contain have been becoming less random over time in a progression whose statistical significance the outside assessment confirmed as real and whose conventional explanation the geophysicist was unable to provide. The third data stream is the one that Taylor has been most careful about in every public reference he has made to the current investigation phase: the thermal anomaly documentation from the Perimeter Monitoring Network. What that documentation shows across the recent recording period is a change in the frequency and the proximity of anomalous thermal signatures at the ranch boundary that the Perimeter program has been logging since its establishment. The signatures are appearing more often, they are appearing closer to the fence line, and they are appearing in the coordinated spatial distributions that the investigation's prior analysis established as the behavioral signature of whatever the perimeter cameras have been documenting. Distributions that the materials scientist brought in for the outside assessment noted, without being told anything about the prior investigation record, were inconsistent with any known animal behavior pattern in any terrestrial ecosystem she had previously encountered in her research work. The geophysicist's assessment of the underground data produced the finding that Taylor has described in the limited internal communications that have been referenced in accounts of the lockdown decision as the most technically significant result the outside assessment generated. Her professional background in electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations gave her the analytical framework to engage with the Mesa zone's underground data in a way that the investigation's prior geological consultants, whose backgrounds were in surface geology and mining, had not been positioned to apply. What she found when she applied that framework to the combined electromagnetic and vibration data from the underground measurement network was a correspondence between the two data streams that the investigation's internal analysis had identified as potentially significant without being able to characterize technically. The electromagnetic readings and the vibration signatures from the underground sensor network are not independent. Their variations are correlated. Specific changes in the electromagnetic data are consistently followed by specific changes in the vibration data, and the relationship between those changes follows a pattern whose mathematical structure the geophysicist's analysis characterized as consistent with a coupled system rather than two independent phenomena occurring in the same location. A coupled system is a physical system in which two or more components interact with each other, in which the state of each component influences the state of the others. The electromagnetic environment and the physical vibration environment beneath the Skinwalker Ranch Mesa are behaving as components of a coupled system. Whatever is generating the electromagnetic signal is connected to whatever is generating the vibration signatures. They are not two separate anomalous features of the underground environment. They are two expressions of the same thing. The geophysicist's characterization of what that thing might be is the element of her assessment that the investigation's internal record captures with the most carefully chosen language. She said that the coupled system's behavior was consistent with a system that was responding to an external input. The input she identified as the most likely candidate, based on the timing correlations between the coupled system's state changes and the surface-level events documented in the investigation's concurrent records, was the drilling operation. The underground coupled system responds to the drilling. Its responses are not random. They are structured, they are directional, and they are escalating in a manner that the geophysicist described as consistent with a system approaching a threshold state. What happens at that threshold, she declined to speculate about. What she confirmed is that the system is moving toward it. The physicist specializing in directed energy systems brought a professional framework to the assessment that no prior scientific consultant engaged by the Skinwalker Ranch investigation had possessed. His background in classified defense research involving directed electromagnetic energy, the development, deployment, and detection of systems that use focused electromagnetic radiation as operational instruments, gave him a reference vocabulary for the electromagnetic data from the Mesa zone that the investigation's internal analysis had been working without. What he said about the signal when he reviewed the data before being told where it was collected is the element of the outside assessment that has been described by people familiar with the lockdown decision as the finding that moved Brandon Fugel from concern to action. The signal's characteristics, the frequency range, the internal structure, the directional propagation pattern, and the specific relationship between its amplitude and its spatial distribution across the measurement network are consistent in the directed energy physicist's professional assessment with an intentionally generated signal rather than a naturally occurring one, not consistent as a possibility, consistent as the most technically supportable interpretation of the data. A naturally occurring electromagnetic signal generated by geological processes, atmospheric conditions, or any other conventional environmental source does not have the internal structure this signal has. Geological electromagnetic signatures are broadband and unstructured. Atmospheric signatures are variable and condition-dependent. What the Mesa zone's instruments have been recording has neither of those characteristics. It has the characteristics of a signal that was designed. The directed energy physicist's professional experience with designed electromagnetic signals, with the technical specifications of intentionally generated directed energy in classified defense applications, gave him the framework to recognize those characteristics in the Mesa data and to describe what he recognized with the precision that his background demanded. He told the assessment team that the signal beneath the Skinwalker Ranch Mesa bore the technical hallmarks of a directed energy system operating in a frequency range and with an internal structure that no human technology he was aware of had been demonstrated to produce. Not similar to human technology, not reminiscent of human technology, beyond the demonstrated capability of any human technology he had professional knowledge of. That assessment, from a physicist whose classified defense research background gave him access to the full range of human-directed energy capability, is what the lockdown was built around. The materials scientist's role in the outside assessment was initially conceived as the most peripheral of the three, a supplementary validation of the physical evidence component of the investigation's findings rather than a primary analytical contribution to the assessment of the instrument data. What her engagement with the investigation's data produced was anything but peripheral. Her prior laboratory work on physical samples from the ranch's active zones, conducted under blind submission protocols similar to those used for the DNA analysis that other external assessments had applied to biological material from the property, had generated results that the investigation had held in its internal record without public disclosure. The assessment engagement gave her access to the full body of the investigation's physical evidence documentation for the first time, allowing her to contextualize the prior laboratory results against the instrument data that the other two scientists were assessing simultaneously. What that contextualization produced is the finding that the materials scientist has described in the limited accounts available from the assessment process as the one that stayed with her longest after she left the property. The physical evidence from the ranch's active zones, the compositional anomalies in material samples recovered from areas of concentrated electromagnetic activity, the thermal characteristics of objects documented in proximity to the underground void boundaries, and the structural properties of recovered material whose characteristics the prior laboratory analysis had not been able to account for conventionally, are consistent with the kind of material transformation that the directed energy physicist's signal assessment would predict. A directed energy system operating in the frequency range and with the intensity that the Mesa data suggests would produce specific and identifiable effects on the physical materials in its operational field. The materials scientist found those effects in the physical evidence record. The correspondence between the signal characteristics the directed energy physicist identified and the material transformation signatures the materials scientist documented in the physical evidence is not incidental. It is the physical evidence that the signal is real, that it is operating at the intensity the instrument data indicates, and that it has been producing measurable effects on the physical environment of the ranch's active zones for a period of time whose beginning the materials analysis is not able to establish, because the evidence of transformation in the oldest samples the investigation has recovered is as advanced as the evidence in the most recent ones. Whatever is generating that signal has been generating it for longer than the investigation has been running. The materials scientist's contribution to the assessment was to confirm that the instrument data and the physical evidence are documenting the same phenomenon, and that the phenomenon has been operating on this property for a very long time. The combined findings of the three outside scientists were presented to Brandon Fugel in a formal assessment summary delivered at the end of the evaluation period. The accounts of people familiar with the presentation describe a meeting whose atmosphere was unlike any prior review session in the investigation's history, not because the findings were unexpected. Fugel and Taylor had understood the direction the data was pointing before the outside assessment was commissioned, but because having those findings confirmed by three independent scientists whose professional credentials placed them entirely outside the investigation's internal framework removed the last buffer between what the data had been suggesting and what the investigation was now required to treat as confirmed. Fugel's response to the assessment summary was not immediate. The accounts describe him spending an extended period reviewing the combined findings before speaking. When he did speak, The first thing he said was not about the science. It was about the people on the property, the crew members, the production staff, the technical team. Everyone whose presence on the ranch in the current investigation phase constituted an ongoing exposure to a phenomenon that the outside assessment had just confirmed was operating at a scale and with an intentionality that none of the prior season's safety protocols had been designed around. The lockdown decision followed from that concern directly, not from the scientific implications of what the assessment had confirmed. Those implications were significant enough to occupy the investigation's analytical attention for a long time to come. From the immediate practical question of whether the people currently working on the property were doing so with adequate understanding of what the outside assessment had just established about the environment they were working in. Fugel's answer to that question was that they were not, and his response to that answer was the lockdown. The gates were closed, the active investigation was suspended, and the communication to the History Channel that followed, the communication that has produced the public acknowledgement of the lockdown that this video documents, was made with the directness of a man who has spent years carefully managing what he says about this property, and who has decided that this specific development is one that the audience the investigation has built across 5 seasons deserves to be told about honestly. A lockdown at Skinwalker Ranch is not a pause. It is not a production break or a scheduled hiatus in the investigation's operational calendar. The investigation that Brandon Fugel has been running since 2016 has never had a scheduled hiatus. The continuous monitoring infrastructure runs regardless of whether an active investigation team is on the property, and the data that infrastructure produces has driven the research agenda across every season without interruption. What the lockdown represents is a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between the investigation and the phenomenon it has been studying. A reassessment driven by the outside assessment's confirmation that the phenomenon is operating at a scale, with a technical sophistication, and with an apparent awareness of the investigation's activity that the prior 5 seasons' safety and operational frameworks were not built to account for. The specific operational changes the lockdown has produced are not fully in the public domain. What is known from the accounts available is that the active investigation team's presence on the property has been suspended pending the development of revised protocols that reflect what the outside assessment established about the electromagnetic environment in the active zones. The physical infrastructure changes that the lockdown has prompted, the assessment of the current monitoring equipment safety specifications against the signal intensity the directed energy physicist confirmed, the evaluation of the crew's prior exposure history against the materials scientists' findings about the physical transformation effects the signal produces, represent an operational overhaul of a kind that the investigation has never previously undertaken. What the lockdown also represents for the investigation's public record is a communication whose significance the audience that has followed the show across 5 seasons is fully equipped to understand. Brandon Fugel has never closed the gates before. He has never suspended active investigation for any reason. The fact that he has done so now, in response to a scientific assessment whose findings he has chosen to characterize publicly rather than manage privately, communicates something specific about what the assessment confirmed that is separate from and more significant than any technical description of the findings themselves. It communicates that whatever has been operating beneath and around Skinwalker Ranch has been confirmed as something that the people getting close to it need to approach differently than they have been. That communication is the most honest thing the investigation has produced in 5 seasons of remarkable honesty, and it deserves to be heard. Every program that has ever investigated Skinwalker Ranch has eventually stopped. The Shermans left. NIDS wound down. AWSAP classified its findings and went quiet. What made Fugel different was that he never stopped. Until now, the lockdown is not a failure of the investigation. It is the investigation's most honest moment, the point at which the man who built the most sophisticated research operation this property has ever seen looked at what 3 independent scientists confirmed and decided that continuing without acknowledging what they found would be the wrong kind of courage. The signal beneath the mesa is real, it is intentional, it is escalating, and it has been operating on this property for longer than anyone has been keeping records. Brandon Fugel locked the gates because the science demanded it. What the science confirmed is what every prior program encountered and chose not to say out loud. The next phase of this investigation will be the first one that approaches the ranch knowing exactly what it is dealing with. That changes everything about what comes next. Skinwalker Ranch has spent decades producing phenomenon that science cannot explain and questions that no institution has been willing to answer. But what is breaking right now from the property is different in character from everything that came before it. This is not another anomalous reading or another piece of equipment failing in a localized zone. This is the ranch communicating something specific, and the news it is breaking is not good. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Skinwalker Ranch is telling us right now demands to be heard. Skinwalker Ranch in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah has never been a passive location. Every other allegedly haunted or paranormal property in the documented history of this field sits and waits for investigators to come and find what it contains. Skinwalker Ranch has never operated that way. From the moment the Sherman family arrived in the early 1990s and found themselves confronted with a catalog of phenomenon that dismantled their understanding of the physical world within weeks of moving onto the property, the ranch has functioned less like a location where strange things happen and more like a location that is actively doing something. The distinction matters more now than it ever has. The Sherman family's account of their time on the property, cattle mutilated with a surgical precision that veterinary analysis could not attribute to any known predator or instrument, objects appearing and disappearing from locked structures, lights moving through the night sky in patterns that violated every known principle of aerodynamics, and at least one encounter with something physical and enormous that left evidence in the soil and left Terry Sherman with a conviction about what he had seen that decades of subsequent ridicule never shook, was not an account of a family being disturbed by random paranormal activity. It was an account of a family being subjected to a sustained and escalating series of events that appeared to have a source, a direction, and something uncomfortably close to an intention. The government researchers who followed the Shermans, first under the NIDS program funded by Robert Bigelow, then under the Pentagon's AAWSAP initiative that designated the ranch as a primary research site and directed classified resources toward understanding what was concentrated there, documented a phenomenon that behaved with the same quality of apparent intention across independent research programs separated by years of time and significant differences in methodology. The phenomenon responded to observation. It responded to technology. It appeared to track the capability level of whoever was investigating it and to calibrate its activity accordingly, producing evidence just beyond the reach of whatever instruments were currently deployed, as though it understood the threshold of what could be documented and stayed one step ahead of it. Brandon Fugel bought the property in 2016 with the resources and the determination to close that gap. What the investigations he has funded and facilitated across 5 seasons of documented research have produced is a body of evidence that has narrowed the distance between the phenomenon and the instruments dramatically. And what the ranch has been communicating through that narrowing distance recently is what this video is about. Because for the first time in the documented history of Skinwalker Ranch, the gap between what the phenomenon is doing and what the instruments can capture has closed enough that the message is becoming legible, and it is not a reassuring one. Every season of the documented Skinwalker Ranch investigation has produced a specific category of evidence that escalated in significance from the season before it. This is not the escalation pattern of a television production manufacturing drama through progressive revelation. It is a pattern that exists in the raw data independent of how the broadcast episodes were assembled, and that researchers who have examined the underlying investigation records have consistently identified as meaningful. The early seasons established the baseline, the electromagnetic anomalies concentrated in specific zones of the property, the aerial phenomenon documented above the Mesa, the physical effects on crew members and equipment operating in active areas of the ranch. That baseline was extraordinary by any standard applied to paranormal investigation. But it was also, in retrospect, the ranch operating at a level of output calibrated to the investigative capability that had been brought to bear on it. As the capability increased, as the technology deployed on the property became more sophisticated, as the scientific credentials of the researchers involved deepened, and as the commitment of resources to sustained investigation rather than episodic visits grew, the ranch's output escalated in direct proportion. The underground anomalies revealed by deep sonar work in later seasons represented a categorical shift from the surface and aerial phenomenon that dominated the early investigation record. The suggestion that significant structured voids existed beneath the mesa at depths that the drilling operation had not yet reached introduced a subterranean dimension to the ranch's activity that reframed everything the surface investigation had documented. If what was operating in the airspace above the ranch and affecting the physical environment on its surface was connected to something operating underground beneath it, then the property was not a location where a phenomenon was occurring. It was an interface, a point of contact between whatever existed beneath the ground and whatever was moving through the sky above it. The research conducted in the most recent seasons has been pushing toward that interface with an urgency and a methodological sophistication that no prior investigation of the property has matched. And what the instruments have been detecting as the investigation approaches the underground structures the sonar identified as what the ranch has apparently been building towards since the first camera was pointed at the sky above the mesa. The readings are not getting stranger as the investigation gets closer to the underground structures. They are getting clearer, and clarity, in this context, is more unsettling than strangeness. Strangeness is ambiguous. Clarity is not. What the instruments are now reading with increasing precision beneath the surface of Skinwalker Ranch is a signal that the investigation did not generate and cannot turn off. It was already there when the first instrument was deployed. It will be there when the last one is packed away. The question that the most recent data forces is not what the signal is. The question is what it means. And the answer to that question is the news the ranch is breaking right now. The mesa at the center of Skinwalker Ranch has been the focal point of the documented investigation since the earliest seasons of the show established it as the location of the most concentrated anomalous activity on the property, the aerial phenomenon documented above it, the electromagnetic readings that spike in its vicinity, the physical effects reported by crew members operating near it, and the underground sonar returns that suggest significant structured voids beneath it have all consistently pointed to the mesa as the hub of whatever network of activity the ranch represents. What has been established through the deep sonar and ground-penetrating radar work conducted in recent seasons is a picture of the underground environment beneath the mesa that no geological model for this region adequately accounts for. The voids detected at depth are not isolated. They are connected, a network of underground spaces whose arrangement and dimensions are inconsistent with the natural cave formation processes that the geological characteristics of the Uinta Basin would predict. Natural caves follow the path of least resistance through soluble rock, producing irregular asymmetrical voids shaped entirely by the chemistry of water moving through stone over geological time. What the instruments have mapped beneath the mesa does not follow that pattern. The spaces are too consistent in their geometry, the connections between them are too regular in their spacing, and the depths at which the largest voids are concentrated correspond precisely with the depths at which the electromagnetic anomalies detected on the surface are most intensely focused, a correspondence that indicates the underground structures and the surface phenomenon are not independent features of the property but components of the same system operating across the boundary between the subterranean environment and the surface above it. The drilling operation that has been attempting to physically access the underground structures beneath the mesa has encountered resistance that the geological composition of the formation does not explain. Equipment that operates without difficulty on comparable geological formations elsewhere in the Uinta Basin has failed at specific depths beneath the mesa in patterns that the production's technical team has documented across multiple drilling attempts, and that are consistent enough to constitute a documented pattern rather than a series of independent mechanical failures. Something beneath the mesa is not indifferent to the drilling operation. The resistance the drilling has encountered is calibrated. It intensifies at specific depths and in specific locations in a manner that correlates with the underground structure map the sonar has produced. Whatever is down there knows the drilling is happening, and the news it is communicating through the pattern of that resistance is the first specific message the ranch has delivered in a form that the investigation has been technically equipped to read. Among the most significant and least discussed findings to emerge from the Skinwalker Ranch investigation in its most recent phases is the detection of structured electromagnetic signals emanating from beneath the property at frequencies and with characteristics that the investigation's scientific team has been unable to attribute to any known natural or human-made source. Electromagnetic signals in themselves are not extraordinary. The ranch has been producing anomalous electromagnetic readings since the first instrument was deployed on the property. What distinguishes the signals detected in the most recent phase of the investigation is their structure. Random electromagnetic noise produced by geological activity, atmospheric conditions, or equipment interference is distinguishable from structured signals by its lack of internal organization. It varies without pattern, spikes without regularity, and carries no information in the technical sense of that word. What the instruments beneath the Skinwalker Ranch Mesa have been detecting does not have those characteristics. The signals carry internal organization. They repeat with a regularity that random noise does not produce. They vary in ways that are patterned rather than chaotic. Variations that cycle through sequences with a consistency that, in any other context, would immediately be classified as communication rather than background noise. Travis Taylor, whose background in advanced physics and directed energy research gives him a technical framework for signal analysis that most paranormal investigators lack, has referenced the underground signal data in terms that stop short of explicit characterization, but that carry an implication. His scientific training would not permit him to state directly without a level of verification the investigation has not yet achieved. What he has said in the careful language of a scientist who understands the professional consequences of overstating a finding is that the signal characteristics are inconsistent with any known geological or atmospheric process, and that the data warrants further analysis by specialists whose expertise in signal structure and communication theory exceeds what the current investigation team encompasses. That is a scientist's way of saying that what the instruments are detecting beneath Skinwalker Ranch looks like a message. The news the ranch is breaking is embedded in that signal, and the reason it is not good is not because the signal is threatening in any overt sense. It is because a structured signal of unknown origin emanating from beneath a property with the documented history of Skinwalker Ranch detected at depths that correspond to underground structures whose geometry is inconsistent with natural formation by instruments whose readings have been independently verified across multiple sessions does not have a reassuring explanation available to it. Every explanation that fits the evidence points in the same direction, and that direction is one that the scientific establishment, the governmental institutions that have been monitoring this property for decades, and the broader public conversation about what is and is not possible in the physical world are not currently equipped to absorb without significant disruption to frameworks that a great many institutions have a great deal invested in maintaining. The broadcast version of Skinwalker Ranch across its most recent seasons has demonstrated a quality that careful viewers of the show have noted without always being able to articulate precisely. The investigations have been producing data of increasing specificity and significance. The scientific team has been responding to that data with a visible quality of controlled urgency, a restraint in how conclusions are stated that reads less like scientific caution and more like awareness of what stating those conclusions plainly would mean. There is a difference between a scientist who has ambiguous data and is genuinely uncertain about its implications, and a scientist who has data whose implications are clear and is choosing carefully how much of that clarity to put on record. The behavior of the Skinwalker Ranch scientific team across the most recent seasons has increasingly exhibited the characteristics of the second category rather than the first. Travis Taylor does not appear uncertain about what the underground signal data means. He appears aware of what it means and in the process of determining what can be said about it within a framework of professional and institutional constraints that the broadcast format of the show has never fully surfaced for the audience. Brandon Fugel's recent public statements about the ranch have shifted in a direction that is consistent with a property owner who has moved from investigation towards something closer to preparation. A subtle but detectable change in how he discusses what the ranch has produced and what his responsibilities in relation to those findings are. The questions the investigation is no longer asking are as significant as the questions it is actively pursuing. Early seasons of the show organized each episode around specific investigative questions. What is causing the electromagnetic anomaly in this zone? What is the origin of the aerial phenomenon above the mesa? What does the sonar return in this section of the underground indicate? The most recent investigation activity has moved away from that question-per-episode structure towards something that looks more like the systematic documentation of a phenomenon whose basic nature the team has resolved and whose specific parameters they are now mapping with the focused methodology of people who know what they are dealing with and are building a record of it. That shift in investigative posture is itself the most significant communication the ranch has produced in its most recent phase. The investigation has stopped asking what is here. It is now asking what it is doing and what comes next. The answer to that second question is the news the ranch is breaking. And the reason the team has been careful about how explicitly it states that answer on camera is the same reason that the government programs that investigated this property for decades never published their findings. Some answers, once they are fully public, cannot be managed, and the people who have been closest to this investigation for the longest time understand that what the ranch is communicating right now is exactly that kind of answer. To understand the full weight of what Skinwalker Ranch is currently communicating, it is necessary to pull back from the property itself and examine it within the context of the broader Uinta Basin, because the phenomenon documented at the ranch is not confined to its boundaries and never has been. The basin stretches across a vast section of northeastern Utah, whose geological, atmospheric, and electromagnetic characteristics have made it one of the most consistently anomalous regions in the continental United States for as long as systematic measurement has been applied to it. The concentration of reported UAP activity above the basin, the pattern of electromagnetic anomalies distributed across its geography, and the underground structural abnormalities that deep geological surveys have documented across multiple sections of the region all indicate that what is operating at Skinwalker Ranch is a local manifestation of a basin-wide phenomenon rather than an isolated property-specific event. The discoveries made in recent years at Blind Frog Ranch, located less than 15 miles from Skinwalker Ranch within the same basin, have added a physical dimension to this understanding that the aerial and electromagnetic evidence alone could not provide. The underground chamber accessed by the Blind Frog Ranch excavation team, with its geometric consistency, its treated wall surfaces, and the structured markings documented within it, represents the first direct physical access point to whatever network of underground structures the deep sonar work across the basin has been suggesting exists beneath this region. The correspondence between what the Blind Frog Ranch excavation found underground and what the Skinwalker Ranch sonar has been mapping beneath the Mesa is too specific to be coincidental. Both properties sit above underground formations whose geometry is inconsistent with natural cave development. Both properties produce surface phenomena, electromagnetic anomalies, aerial objects, physical effects on human observers that is concentrated directly above those underground formations. And both properties have demonstrated a pattern of active resistance to investigation that goes beyond the passive strangeness of genuinely haunted locations and into the territory of a system responding to external interference. The Ute people, whose ancestral relationship to this land predates any outside investigation, have maintained for generations that the basin is a place of threshold, a region where something that normally operates beyond the range of human perception becomes intermittently accessible. The structured underground signal detected beneath Skinwalker Ranch in the most recent investigation phase, mapped against the physical evidence of constructed underground chambers discovered at Blind Frog Ranch 15 miles away, suggests that the threshold the Ute traditions describe is not a metaphor. It is a physical infrastructure. And whatever built it is communicating something through it right now that the investigation on the surface above it is only beginning to be technically equipped to receive. The history of governmental interest in Skinwalker Ranch is now sufficiently documented in the public record that it can be addressed without speculation. The AAWSAP program, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, operated from 2007 through 2012 under Pentagon funding channeled through the Defense Intelligence Agency, and directed significant classified research resources toward the Uinta Basin with Skinwalker Ranch as its primary investigation site. The program's existence was not publicly acknowledged until a series of investigative journalism pieces and subsequent congressional attention forced partial disclosure in 2017. What was disclosed was the program's existence and its general focus. What was not disclosed was its findings. The portions of the AAWSAP research that have entered the public record through Freedom of Information requests and the limited voluntary disclosures of former program participants indicate a body of findings that goes significantly beyond what any public investigation of the ranch has produced. Researchers operating under the program documented phenomenon at the ranch that included physical trace evidence, biological effects on human observers, and instrument readings whose technical specifications have not been fully released, in a systematic and well-resourced investigation that ran for years with a level of funding and institutional support that dwarfs anything the private investigation of the property has been able to deploy. What those researchers concluded, based on years of classified fieldwork at a location they had the resources to study in ways the broadcast investigation has never been permitted to match, has never been made public in any form that constitutes a full accounting of their findings. The pattern of how former AAWSAP participants discuss the ranch when they discuss it at all, with a specificity of restraint that indicates not uncertainty about conclusions but awareness of constraints on disclosure, is consistent with people who know what is underneath that mesa and have been instructed not to say it plainly. The structured signal detected by the current investigation's instruments corresponds in its frequency, characteristics to readings documented in technical appendices of AAWSAP-related reports that have partially surfaced through Freedom of Information disclosures. The government has been receiving this signal for longer than the current investigation has been running. They know what it is, they know what it means, and the fact that the current investigation is now detecting it with instruments precise enough to characterize its structure is the development that makes the news the ranch is breaking now different from anything it has communicated before. The investigation has caught up to the signal, and catching up to it means that the question of what it contains can no longer be deferred by reference to insufficient instrument sensitivity. The data is now good enough to read. The reading is not good, and the government's decades of silence about what they found at this property is the clearest indication available of exactly how not good it is. The news the ranch is breaking is not metaphorical. The structured signal beneath the mesa has been increasing in intensity across the most recent investigation sessions in a pattern that the technical team has documented as directional, not fluctuating randomly but building consistently in one direction. The signal intensifies when the drilling advances. It spikes at specific depths. It modulates when the drilling pauses. Whatever is generating that signal from beneath the mesa is aware of the investigation happening above it and is responding to it in real time in a manner the current instruments can now document with enough precision to rule out every conventional explanation. Something underneath Skinwalker Ranch knows the investigation is getting closer. The gap between what the phenomenon is doing and what the instruments can capture has finally closed enough that the response is legible. And what it is communicating through that response is not a fluctuation in background noise. It is a signal with internal structure, directional intent, and a source that the investigation is now close enough to that turning back would not change what has already been received. A routine perimeter sweep at Skinwalker Ranch was supposed to produce nothing. Standard operating procedure. Cameras running, instruments logging, another night of baseline documentation on a property that has spent decades producing phenomenon that nobody can explain. What the footage captured during that sweep was not baseline. It was not explainable, and when the team reviewed it the following morning, the conversation in that room stopped in a way that nobody present has been willing to fully describe on camera since. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what the perimeter footage revealed changes everything. Skinwalker Ranch in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah has never behaved the way a normal piece of land behaves. Every other property in the documented history of paranormal investigation sits and waits for something to happen. Skinwalker Ranch has never operated that way. From the moment the Sherman family arrived in the early 1990s and encountered a catalog of phenomenon that dismantled their understanding of physical reality within weeks of moving onto the property, the ranch has functioned less like a location where strange things happen and more like a location that is actively producing them with what researchers who have spent serious time there have described as an unsettling quality of intention. The Shermans documented cattle mutilations performed with a surgical precision that veterinary analysis could not attribute to any known predator or instrument. Objects appeared and disappeared from locked structures without mechanical explanation. Lights moved through the night sky in patterns that violated every known principle of aerodynamics. And something physical and enormous left evidence in the soil of the property that Terry Sherman spent the rest of his life describing in terms that the subsequent decades of ridicule never shook. What the government researchers who followed the Shermans onto the property documented was a phenomenon that behaved with the same quality of apparent intention across independent research programs separated by years of time and significant differences in methodology. The NIDS program funded by Robert Bigelow and the Pentagon's AAWSAP initiative that followed it both produced findings pointing in the same direction. A phenomenon that responded to observation, that appeared to track the capability level of whoever was investigating it, and that calibrated its activity in direct correspondence with the sophistication of the instruments being deployed. Brandon Fugel bought the property in 2016 with the resources to close the gap between what the phenomenon was producing and what the instrumentation could capture. 5 seasons of documented investigation have narrowed that gap significantly. The perimeter sweep program, the network of cameras and sensors running continuously continuously around the ranch's boundary was designed to catch what the targeted investigation sessions inside the property's active zones were missing. The assumption behind the program was that whatever was producing the phenomenon at the ranch's interior was generating it from within the property boundary. The perimeter footage reviewed following the sweep in question challenged that assumption in a way that nobody on the investigation team was prepared for, because what the cameras caught was not coming from inside the ranch. It was approaching from outside it, and the implications of that distinction are what make the footage the most significant thing the perimeter program has ever produced. The decision to establish a continuous perimeter monitoring program around Skinwalker Ranch was not made in a production meeting. It was made in response to a specific pattern in the investigation data that had accumulated across multiple seasons of fieldwork, and that pointed to a gap in the surveillance architecture the investigation had been operating with: the targeted investigation sessions inside the active zones of the ranch, the Mesa, the Homestead Triangle, the areas of concentrated electromagnetic anomaly that the early seasons had identified, were producing data of increasing specificity and significance. What they were not producing was information about what was happening at the ranch's boundaries during the periods between active investigation sessions. The phenomenon documented at the ranch had consistently demonstrated an awareness of when investigation activity was occurring and where it was concentrated. Equipment failed at rates that correlated with proximity to active investigation zones. Aerial phenomenon was documented predominantly during active session windows. Physical effects on crew members were concentrated in periods of direct investigative engagement with the property's most active areas. The pattern suggested that whatever was producing the phenomenon was responsive to investigation activity in real time, that it tracked where the cameras and instruments were deployed and calibrated its activity accordingly. The perimeter program was designed to address this by establishing a surveillance presence that the phenomenon could not avoid by simply staying clear of wherever the active investigation was focused. Cameras and sensors running continuously around the full boundary of the property would document whatever was occurring at the ranch's edges, regardless of where the active investigation team was positioned inside it. The technical infrastructure deployed for the perimeter program represented the most sophisticated continuous surveillance architecture the investigation had yet committed to a single monitoring function. Infrared cameras capable of detecting movement and heat signatures in complete darkness, acoustic sensors running across the full audible and infrasound spectrum, electromagnetic monitoring stations positioned at intervals around the perimeter logging fields strength and frequency data continuously, ground vibration sensors calibrated to detect movement at depths corresponding to the underground structures the sonar had identified beneath the property. The program ran for months before the sweep in question produced the footage that changed what everyone involved thought they understood about the nature and the source of what Skinwalker Ranch has been documenting for decades. What the cameras logged during that sweep was reviewed the following morning by a technical team whose collective fieldwork experience at the ranch runs to hundreds of investigation sessions across multiple seasons. The review session lasted longer than any prior footage review in the program's history, and when it ended, the first call made was not to the production team. It was to a researcher whose background is not in paranormal investigation. To understand the full significance of what the perimeter sweep footage revealed, it is necessary to first understand what every prior investigation of Skinwalker Ranch had been focused on, and what that focus had systematically caused everyone to overlook. The documented history of investigation at the ranch, from the Sherman family's first-hand accounts through the NIDS and AAWSAP programs, and into the current broadcast investigation, has been organized around a consistent assumption. The assumption is that the source of the phenomenon is inside the ranch's boundary, the Mesa, the homestead, the active zones identified through years of instrument deployment. All of it has been treated as the origin point of whatever is producing the extraordinary catalog of documented events that have made this property the most investigated paranormal location in American history. That assumption shaped every research program that engaged with the ranch. It shaped which areas the instruments were concentrated in. It shaped the questions the investigations were designed to answer. And it shaped the surveillance architecture that every investigation, including the current one, had deployed before the perimeter program introduced a monitoring presence that looked outward from the ranch boundary rather than inward toward its active zones. The AAWSAP researchers who spent years at the property with a level of funding and institutional support that dwarfs anything the private investigation has been able to deploy were working inside the same assumption. Their instruments were concentrated on the property's interior. Their investigation sessions were organized around the active zones the preliminary data had identified. Their findings, the portions that have entered the public record through Freedom of Information disclosures, are all oriented inward, toward what is happening inside the ranch boundary rather than toward what might be approaching it from outside. Bruce Leland, a researcher with extensive fieldwork in the region, noted in a published assessment of the cumulative Skinwalker Ranch investigation record that the entire body of documented research shared a single methodological blind spot. Every program had been designed to study the phenomenon from within the territory it was already known to occupy. None of them had deployed systematic monitoring of the approach vectors, the directions and pathways through which whatever was producing the phenomenon arrived at the property before the investigation cameras ever had a chance to document it. The perimeter sweep program was the first systematic attempt to close that blind spot. What it documented when it finally caught something in the sweep in question was evidence that the blind spot had been hiding the most significant element of what Skinwalker Ranch represents. Not what happens inside the boundary, but what the boundary itself is an interface for. The footage from that sweep did not show the phenomenon operating inside the ranch. It showed the phenomenon arriving, and the direction it was arriving from, and the manner in which it was approaching, is what sent the technical team's first call to a researcher whose expertise is not in paranormal investigation. The perimeter sweep that produced the footage in question was conducted during a period of reduced active investigation activity at the ranch, a window between targeted session deployments when the interior of the property was not occupied by the investigation team, and the only surveillance running was the continuous perimeter monitoring network. This detail is significant. The phenomenon documented at the ranch across its investigation history has consistently exhibited an awareness of when active investigation sessions are occurring and a calibrated response to that awareness. During active sessions, the phenomenon produces evidence within the range of whatever instruments are deployed. During inactive periods, the documented assumption has always been that whatever is producing the phenomenon is dormant or absent. The perimeter sweep footage challenges that assumption directly. The cameras began logging anomalous readings at 2:17 in the morning. The electromagnetic monitoring station on the ranch's northern boundary registered a field strength elevation that the continuous baseline data for that station identified as outside the normal variance range for that position. The elevation was not dramatic in its initial magnitude. It was the kind of reading that in a single session review might have been flagged as an instrument artifact and set aside. What made it significant was its duration and its directionality. The elevation held steady for 11 minutes. It did not spike and return to baseline in the pattern of an equipment artifact or an atmospheric transient. It held, and then it began moving. The electromagnetic anomaly tracked across the northern boundary sensors in a sequential pattern, Station 1 registering the elevation first, then Station 2, then 3, in a progression consistent with something moving along the outside of the ranch's northern perimeter, at a pace the sensor data allowed the technical team to calculate. The infrared cameras covering the northern boundary logged their first anomalous reading at 2:23. The image captured in that initial frame, and in the 47 frames that followed across the next 6 minutes, is what the technical team spent the rest of that review session trying to find a conventional explanation for. The acoustic sensors running along the northern perimeter registered something in the infrasound range beginning at 2:19, 2 minutes before the infrared cameras logged their first visual anomaly, at frequencies and with a structural pattern that the audio specialist on the technical team identified as unlike anything in the ranch's prior acoustic monitoring record. The ground vibration sensors logged their first reading at 2:21. The vibration signature they recorded was not consistent with animal movement across the surface. It was consistent with something moving through the underground formation that runs beneath the northern section of the ranch's boundary. All 4 sensor categories registered anomalous readings within a 6-minute window. All 4 readings were directionally consistent, originating outside the ranch boundary and moving toward its interior, and all 4 ceased simultaneously at 2:29, 12 minutes after the electromagnetic station first logged the elevation that started the sequence. The infrared footage from the northern perimeter cameras covering the relevant window is the centerpiece of what the sweep produced, and the element of the recording that the technical team returned to repeatedly during the review session that followed. Infrared cameras operating at the sensitivity level deployed in the perimeter program produce imagery that is unambiguous in its basic content. Heat signatures against a cooler background rendered in the characteristic white-on-black or green-on-black palette that makes thermal imaging one of the most reliable surveillance technologies available for detecting movement in complete darkness. What the cameras logged during the relevant window is not ambiguous in the sense that there is something there. The anomaly is visible across multiple camera feeds covering overlapping sections of the northern perimeter, which eliminates single-camera artifact as an explanation. It is present in consecutive frames across a 6-minute window, which eliminates a transient reflection or atmospheric distortion. And it moves, not randomly, not in the pattern of wind-driven debris or an animal crossing the frame, but with a directionality and a consistency of movement that the technical team's analysis established as purposeful rather than incidental. What the anomaly is, in terms of any category that the investigation's prior experience or the broader scientific literature provides, is where the footage parts company with every conventional explanation the review session produced. The heat signature does not correspond to any known animal species whose range includes the Uinta Basin. Its dimensions, as rendered by the thermal imaging, fall outside the size range of every native and introduced species documented in the region. Its movement pattern across the camera frames does not match the gait signature of any quadruped or biped in the investigation team's reference database, and the manner in which it interacts with the ranch boundary, approaching to within a specific distance, and then holding that distance with a consistency that the frame-by-frame analysis documents across the full 6 minutes of its presence, suggests an awareness of the boundary itself that no animal operating on instinct or territorial behavior would exhibit. The most significant element of the infrared footage is not what is visible in the frames where the anomaly is present. It is what happens in the frames immediately before its first appearance and immediately after its final one. In the 3 frames preceding the first frame in which the anomaly registers, the background thermal environment of the northern perimeter changes in a manner that the camera's baseline data identifies as outside normal variance. The ambient temperature reading across the frame drops by a margin that the technical team's analysis flagged as requiring explanation before the anomaly itself had even been identified as the focus of the review. And in the frames following the anomaly's disappearance, the background thermal environment returns to baseline, not gradually, as it would following a natural temperature event, but instantaneously, between one frame and the next, with no transitional period. That instantaneous return to baseline is the detail that sent the technical team's first call to a researcher outside the investigation's normal chain of consultation. It is not how temperature works. It is not how anything that operates within the known physical parameters of the natural world works, and it is not the first time something documented at Skinwalker Ranch has behaved as though the known physical parameters of the natural world do not apply to it. It is the first time that behavior has been documented at the ranch's perimeter, rather than its interior. The infrared footage is the most immediately striking element of the sweep, but it is not the most analytically significant. That distinction belongs to the instrument data running concurrently, 4 independent data streams that cannot be explained away by any argument about camera artifacts or thermal imaging anomalies. The electromagnetic data from the northern boundary stations tells a story that begins before the cameras logged their first visual anomaly. The field's strength elevation was concentrated and localized, highest at the stations closest to where the infrared cameras placed the anomaly, decreasing in precise inverse proportion to distance. That spatial distribution allows triangulation. When that triangulation is mapped against the infrared footage frame by frame, the electromagnetic source position and the thermal anomaly position correspond with a precision the technical team characterized as beyond the margin of coincidence. The acoustic infrasound data adds a third independent stream. The readings logged 2 minutes before the cameras first captured the thermal anomaly are structured, cycling through a repeating sequence with the internal organization of a signal rather than background noise. The ground vibration data is the 4th stream and the most consequential. Its signature indicates a source at depth, a depth corresponding precisely to the upper boundary of the underground void network the sonar has mapped beneath the northern perimeter. Something was moving through the underground formation at the same time. Something was approaching from above. 4 independent streams, 1 6-minute window, 1 location. The perimeter sweep data forces a reconsideration of the entire body of Skinwalker Ranch investigation that preceded it. Every prior program, NIDS, AAWSAP, the current broadcast investigation, produced its data from inside the property boundary, oriented toward the phenomenon's expression within that boundary. The perimeter footage introduces something none of those programs were architecturally capable of producing, evidence of what the phenomenon does at the boundary itself during periods when the interior is unoccupied and no active investigation is running. What that evidence reveals is that the phenomenon does not go dormant between investigation sessions. It continues operating. And what it does when the interior is unoccupied is different in character from what the active sessions document. The active sessions capture the phenomenon responding to investigation, calibrating its output to instrument capability, producing evidence within the range of what can be captured. The perimeter data captures something different. It captures the phenomenon approaching from outside the boundary, moving along that boundary with an awareness of it, and engaging with the underground structure beneath it in a manner the vibration data establishes as active and deliberate. The implication is the most significant reframing the investigation has produced. The ranch is not the source of the phenomenon, it is a destination. Whatever has been documented at Skinwalker Ranch for decades does not originate on the property. It arrives there, and it arrives through pathways the interior-focused investigation has never been positioned to observe. The section of the Uinta Basin from which the perimeter data establishes the phenomenon was approaching is not a section that prior investigation programs overlooked out of oversight. It was overlooked out of policy. The AAWSAP documents that have partially entered the public record through Freedom of Information disclosures include a geographic mapping assessment of the broader basin. The area corresponding to the approach vector, the perimeter sweep established, is referenced in those documents, in a section whose surrounding context is heavily redacted in a targeted rather than blanket manner. The only unredacted text in the relevant passage does not describe the area in geological or atmospheric terms. It describes it in the language of access restriction. Someone within the AAWSAP structure investigated that section of the basin, documented what they found, and those findings were restricted to a subset of program personnel whose identity the release documents do not disclose. The current investigation has never deployed instruments there. The broadcast episodes have never addressed it. The perimeter sweep footage is the first evidence produced outside the classified research framework that connects it directly to what is operating at the ranch. The government knew where the phenomenon was coming from. They investigated the source, restricted their findings, and said nothing to any research program that came after them. The perimeter footage just pointed the current investigation directly at what they were protecting. Skinwalker Ranch has been documented, investigated, and studied for decades by programs ranging from lone researchers to Pentagon-funded initiatives with classified budgets. Every one of them pointed their instruments inward, at the Mesa, at the homestead, at the active zones inside the boundary. Every one of them was looking in the right place for the wrong reason. The ranch is not where the phenomenon originates. It is where the phenomenon arrives. The perimeter sweep footage is the first evidence produced outside the classified research framework that establishes where it arrives from. And the approach vector it establishes points directly at a section of the Uinta Basin that the government investigated, restricted, and declined to share with anyone who came after them. That section of the basin has never been systematically monitored by any public investigation program. It has never been addressed in any broadcast episode. It has never appeared in any Freedom of Information disclosure in a form that reveals what the AAWSAP team found there. The perimeter footage just changed that. The investigation now has a direction that decades of interior-focused research could never have produced. What is waiting at the end of that approach vector has been waiting for a long time, and whatever it is, the government has known about it since before the current investigation began. Brandon Fugal has spent millions of dollars and years of his life trying to understand what is happening beneath Skinwalker Ranch. He has brought in physicists, aerospace engineers, government-connected scientists, and some of the most sophisticated detection equipment ever deployed at a private research site. He has watched his team get hurt, watched equipment fail without explanation, and watched the Mesa resist every attempt to penetrate its secrets. But what the scientific team detected beneath the Mesa during the most recent phase of investigation was something that none of their frameworks had prepared them for, something that moved, something that responded, something alive. And when Brandon Fugal saw the data, he shut it all down. If you are new here, subscribe now, because what is living beneath the Mesa at Skinwalker Ranch changes everything the scientific team thought they were dealing with. To understand why the detection of life beneath the Mesa at Skinwalker Ranch produced a response serious enough to shut down the entire operation, you first have to understand what the Mesa is within the context of the ranch and why, across every phase of investigation the property has undergone, from the earliest NIDS research through the current Fugal-era scientific program, the Mesa has always occupied a position at the absolute center of whatever is happening on that land. The Mesa is not simply an elevated geological feature on the Skinwalker Ranch property. It is the focal point around which the most significant and the most inexplicable phenomena documented at the ranch have consistently organized themselves across decades of investigation by multiple independent research teams. The Sherman family, who owned the ranch during the period that first brought it to national attention, documented their most extreme and most disturbing experiences in proximity to the Mesa. The NADS team that investigated the property in the late 1990s and early 2000s identified the Mesa as the location producing the highest concentration of anomalous phenomena and dedicated significant investigative resources to understanding what was generating those phenomena without arriving at a satisfactory explanation. Every subsequent investigation team, including the current scientific program operating under Brandon Fugel's ownership, has found the Mesa to be the location where the ranch's phenomena are most concentrated, most consistent, and most resistant to conventional explanation. The physical characteristics of the Mesa have been studied extensively without producing a complete understanding of its geology or its composition. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted during the current investigation have produced returns suggesting structural anomalies beneath the Mesa's surface that do not correspond to the expected geological profile of the region. Anomalies that the scientific team has discussed publicly in terms that acknowledge their existence without fully accounting for what produced them or what they contain. Drilling operations directed at the Mesa have encountered resistance and equipment failure at depths and under conditions that the team's engineers cannot explain through conventional geological frameworks. The airspace above the Mesa has produced more documented anomalous aerial phenomena than any other location on the ranch, and the physical effects on researchers who spend extended time in close proximity to the Mesa, the health impacts, the equipment malfunctions, the psychological and physiological responses that the show has documented across multiple seasons are more pronounced and more severe in the Mesa's vicinity than anywhere else on the property, all of which means that the detection of something alive beneath the Mesa is not simply a new data point added to an existing investigation. It is the thing that every phase of Skinwalker Ranch investigation has been moving toward, the answer to the question that the Mesa has been generating for decades, arriving in a form that nobody on the scientific team was prepared to receive. Understanding the significance of what the scientific team detected beneath the Mesa requires understanding the program that produced the detection. Because the investigation Brandon Fugel has built at Skinwalker Ranch is not a television production using scientific aesthetics for dramatic effect. It is a genuine and substantially funded scientific research program that happens to be documented by a television production, and the distinction matters because it determines the credibility of everything the program produces, including the detection that shut the ranch down. When Brandon Fugel purchased Skinwalker Ranch in 2016 for $4.5 million, he brought to the property something that previous investigations phases had lacked: the combination of substantial private resources, genuine scientific credibility through his connections to the aerospace and technology industries, and a personal commitment to applying the most rigorous available scientific methodology to a set of phenomena that previous investigations had documented but not explained. The team he assembled reflects that commitment. Dr. Travis Taylor, whose background in astrophysics, optical science, and aerospace defense research provided the program with a level of scientific credentialing that no previous Skinwalker Ranch investigation had possessed, was the lead scientist for the program's most intensive investigative phases. The supporting scientific team included specialists in geology, physics, biology, chemistry, and electromagnetic phenomena, as well as engineers with backgrounds in defense and aerospace technology who brought both expertise and equipment to the investigation that would not otherwise have been available to a private research program of this kind. The equipment deployed at the ranch under Fugel's program represents a significant escalation from previous investigation phases. Ground-penetrating radar systems capable of imaging subsurface features at depths and resolutions not previously applied to the property, atmospheric monitoring equipment drawn from aerospace and defense applications, biological detection systems designed for field deployment in environments with complex and variable conditions, and a network of fixed and mobile sensors providing continuous monitoring of the property's electromagnetic, acoustic, and environmental conditions at a level of coverage and resolution that the NIDES program, operating with the technology of the late 1990s, could not have achieved. It is this program, built over years of sustained investment and scientific engagement, that produced the detection beneath the Mesa. And it is the credibility of this program, established through seasons of documented scientific work at the ranch, that makes the shutdown Brandon Fugel ordered in response to that detection something that cannot be dismissed as a production decision or a dramatic narrative choice. The detection that changed everything at Skinwalker Ranch did not arrive as a single dramatic instrument reading or a single moment of equipment response. It arrived the way the most significant scientific findings typically arrive, as an accumulation of data from multiple independent systems that individually suggested something unusual and collectively pointed toward a conclusion that the scientific team found both compelling and deeply unsettling. The initial indication came from the ground-penetrating radar system that had been conducting ongoing subsurface surveys of the Mesa as part of the investigation's long-term geological mapping program. A survey pass conducted during the most recent phase of investigation returned data showing a subsurface anomaly at a depth consistent with the structural irregularities documented in previous surveys, but with a characteristic that had not appeared in prior data. The anomaly was not static. The returns showed a feature that had changed position between successive survey passes, conducted at intervals that the geological team assessed as too short for any known geological process to account for the degree of positional change recorded. Something beneath the mesa had moved. The geological team's initial response was to treat the finding as an instrument artifact, a malfunction or calibration error in the survey equipment, and to run the survey again with recalibrated instruments before drawing any conclusions. The repeat surveys did not resolve the anomaly. They confirmed it, and they added detail that the initial pass had not captured. The moving feature was not uniform in its subsurface signature. It had a boundary, a defined edge that distinguished it from the surrounding geological material in a way that suggested an object or a mass rather than a fluid or gaseous pocket. And its movement between survey passes was not random. It had direction, and across multiple successive surveys, that direction was consistent, suggesting displacement along a trajectory rather than diffuse shifting in response to environmental pressure. When the radar findings were cross-referenced with data from the biological detection systems that had been operating continuously in the Mesa's vicinity, the picture that emerged was one that the scientific team found genuinely difficult to process. The biological sensors had been recording environmental data throughout the period covered by the radar surveys. When that data was reviewed against the timeline of the subsurface anomalies' movements, correlations emerged that the team's scientists assessed as statistically significant. The biological sensor readings elevated during periods corresponding to the anomalies' detected movement, not slightly, substantially and repeatedly, across multiple instances in the data record, with a consistency that the team's statisticians found could not be attributed to coincidence or environmental noise. Something beneath the mesa was moving, and when it moved, the biological detection equipment responded as if something alive was responsible for the movement. The response of the Skinwalker Ranch scientific team to the data produced by the Mesa detection was not immediate alarm or immediate shutdown. It was the methodical and disciplined process of scientists who have spent years operating in an environment that consistently produces data that resists explanation, and who have learned, through that experience, to subject anomalous findings to the most rigorous available scrutiny before drawing conclusions. The first response was verification. Every instrument that had contributed data to the anomalous finding was tested, recalibrated, and run through independent diagnostic assessment to rule out equipment malfunction as an explanation. The ground-penetrating radar system was checked against known reference targets to confirm its spatial accuracy and its positional consistency. The biological detection equipment was calibrated against known environmental inputs to establish that its elevated readings during the anomaly periods were not the product of instrument drift or environmental interference. The data processing and analysis pipeline was reviewed by the team's software and engineering specialists to confirm that the correlations identified between the radar data and the biological sensor data were not artifacts of the analytical method. The verification process took time and was conducted with a thoroughness that reflected both the seriousness of the finding and the scientific team's awareness that a conclusion of this magnitude required the complete elimination of conventional explanations before it could be taken seriously. When the verification process was complete, the conventional explanations had been eliminated. The anomaly was real. The movement was real. The correlation between the movement and the biological sensor response was real. What remained, after every instrument check and every analytical review, was data describing something beneath the mesa at Skinwalker Ranch that was moving with direction and consistency, and whose movement was accompanied by biological sensor responses that the team's scientists could not account for through any mechanism other than the presence of a living organism at the depth and location the radar data indicated. That conclusion was presented to Brandon Fugel. His response was immediate. He reviewed the data personally, asked the scientific team to walk him through their verification process, confirmed that the conventional explanations had been thoroughly excluded, and then made the decision that the data required. He shut the investigation down. The decision Brandon Fugel made when the scientific team presented him with the Mesa detection data was not a simple decision. and understanding it fully requires understanding both what the data showed and what Brandon Fugel's relationship to the ranch, to the investigation, and to the responsibility of ownership actually is. Brandon Fugel is not a person who shuts things down easily or without substantial cause. He is a businessman of considerable success, accustomed to making decisions under conditions of uncertainty and to proceeding with complex and high-stakes endeavors when the evidence supports doing so. He purchased Skinwalker Ranch over the objections of people in his professional circle who thought the acquisition was irrational. He has continued to invest in its investigation through seasons of findings that raised more questions than they answered, and through personal experiences on the property that he has described as genuinely disturbing. He has watched members of his scientific team suffer health effects from their work at the ranch and has continued the investigation. He is not someone who stops because things are difficult or because the findings are uncomfortable. What the Mesa detection data presented him with was something different from discomfort or difficulty. It presented him with a direct implication about what the investigation was dealing with beneath the Mesa, an implication that changed the risk calculus for every person operating on the ranch in a fundamental way. If something alive is moving beneath the Mesa at the depth and scale the data suggested, the investigation's existing safety protocols were built around an incomplete understanding of what those protocols needed to protect against. Every drilling operation directed at the Mesa, every ground disturbance in its vicinity, every activity that had been conducted on the basis of an understanding of the Mesa as a geological feature rather than a geological feature containing living presence needed to be reassessed against a different set of risk parameters. The shutdown was not a retreat. It was a recognition that the investigation had arrived at a threshold where proceeding without a fundamental reassessment of what was being dealt with and what precautions that dealing required would be irresponsible toward the people whose safety Brandon Fugel is responsible for. He shut it down because the data told him that what was beneath the Mesa was not what the investigation had assumed, and that assuming incorrectly about what is beneath the Mesa has consequences that the scientific team could not yet fully scope. The detection of life beneath the Mesa at Skinwalker Ranch raises a question that the scientific community and the broader public interested in the ranch's phenomena will inevitably ask. How did every previous investigation of the property, across decades of research by multiple independent teams with access to the best available technology of their respective eras, miss something that the current program found? The answer to that question is not simple, and it is not flattering to the idea that the previous investigation phases were comprehensive in their scope or their methodology, but it is also not a reflection of incompetence or carelessness on the part of the researchers who conducted them. The NIDES program that investigated the ranch in the late 1990s and early 2000s was operating at the frontier of applied paranormal and anomalous phenomena research with the technology and the methodological frameworks available at that time. The ground-penetrating radar systems available to that program were less capable than the current program's equipment in their depth penetration, their spatial resolution, and their ability to detect subtle changes in subsurface features over time. The biological detection capabilities available to NIDS were not designed for the specific application of detecting biological presence at depth in a complex geological environment. The program documented extraordinary things. It established the foundational evidentiary record for the current investigation to build on, but it was not equipped to find what the current program found, and the absence of a finding is not evidence of an absence. The Sherman family, who preceded NIDS and whose experiences on the property remain the most visceral and the most personally documented in the ranch's recorded history, described encounters and phenomena that, in retrospect, are consistent with an active presence beneath the Mesa in ways that were not recognized as such at the time because the framework for interpreting them in those terms did not exist. The cattle mutilations, the disappearances, the sense described by multiple family members of something beneath the ground that was aware of their presence on the surface. These experiences were documented as evidence of the ranch's anomalous character without being understood as potentially diagnostic of specifically biological subsurface presence. What the current program's detection did was not discover something that previous investigations failed to find. It developed the methodological capability to formally detect and document something that the ranch's own history had been pointing toward for decades. The implications of a confirmed living presence beneath the Mesa at Skinwalker Ranch extend in multiple directions simultaneously, and none of those directions leads to a simple or comfortable destination. The scientific implications alone are significant enough to represent a fundamental challenge to the existing understanding of what can live where At what depth, under what conditions, and with what relationship to the surface environment directly above it. The depth at which the detection data places the anomalous biological presence is not a depth at which any known organism of the implied scale is documented to exist in the geological context of the American interior. Known subterranean life at significant depth consists of microbial communities, insects, and small invertebrates occupying cave systems and groundwater environments, none of which produce the scale of biological sensor response or the subsurface displacement profile that the Mesa detection data describes. Whatever is living beneath the Mesa, if the scientific team's interpretation of the data is correct, is something that the existing biological and geological literature has no category for, and the absence of that category is not a minor gap. It is a hole in the scientific understanding of what is possible in the natural world large enough to require a significant and sustained revision of multiple fields of research simultaneously. The implications for the ranch's documented history of anomalous phenomena are equally significant. If there is a living presence beneath the Mesa, the phenomena that have been documented above it for decades, the equipment failures, the health effects on researchers, the atmospheric anomalies, the aerial phenomena concentrated in the Mesa's airspace, become potentially explicable as the surface manifestations of an active subsurface biology rather than as independent and unconnected anomalies. The Mesa would not be the location where Skinwalker Ranch's phenomena are most concentrated because of some abstract property of the geography. It would be the location where they are most concentrated because something living there is generating them, either directly through its biological processes or indirectly through whatever mechanisms it uses to interact with the environment above it. That reframing changes the entire investigative program. It changes what questions the investigation should be asking, what evidence it should be prioritizing, and what the goal of the investigation actually is. Because understanding a geological and electromagnetic anomaly is a different project from understanding a living organism that has apparently occupied the space beneath the Mesa for a period of time that the investigation has not yet been able to determine. The public statement Brandon Fugal has made about the Mesa detection and the shutdown of the investigation is carefully bounded. He has confirmed that the scientific team found something significant. He has confirmed that the findings prompted him to halt the current phase of investigation. He has framed the shutdown in terms that acknowledge the seriousness of what was detected, without fully characterizing what the detection showed or what the scientific team's interpretation of the data concluded. The gap between what he has said publicly and what the people close to the investigation know he knows is a gap that those who follow Skinwalker Ranch closely have learned to read carefully, because Brandon Fugal is not a person given to understatement, and when he is understating, the distance between what he is saying and what he knows is itself a measure of how significant the undisclosed information is. The people close to the investigation describe a Brandon Fugal who has not simply been shaken by the Mesa detection data in the way that a dramatic and unexpected scientific finding shakes someone. They describe a man who has been processing a specific and detailed understanding of what the data implies and who has been doing that processing against the backdrop of everything he has personally witnessed and experienced at the ranch across years of ownership. Brandon Fugal has had experiences on the Skinwalker Ranch property that he has not fully disclosed publicly. He has been deliberately measured in what he shares about his personal encounters at the ranch, more measured than the members of his scientific team who have spoken more openly about the effects the property has had on them. And that measured quality of his public persona on the subject of the ranch is understood by the people who know him to reflect not a lack of significant personal experience, but a deliberate choice about how much of that experience to bring into the public conversation at any given point. The Mesa detection data gave that deliberate choice a new and more urgent dimension. What Fugal knows about what is beneath the Mesa, assembled from years of personal experience at the ranch, from conversations with the scientific team that have not been made public, and from the specific content of the detection data itself, is a body of knowledge that his public statements have been carefully shaped around without fully revealing. The shutdown he ordered was driven by that knowledge, and the terms on which he will eventually share it fully are terms that the current moment has not yet produced. The shutdown Brandon Fugal ordered is not the end of the Skinwalker Ranch investigation. It is the end of the investigation as it was previously configured, operating on assumptions about the Mesa that the detection data has permanently invalidated. What comes next is structured around a single question that everything before it has been building toward. What is living beneath the Mesa? The biological material and the full detection data record are being analyzed now, and the results of that analysis will determine the terms on which the investigation resumes and the terms on which what was found is disclosed publicly. For Brandon Fugel, this is the moment his 6 years of ownership have produced. He came to the ranch for answers. The Mesa detection is an answer, but one that opens onto questions larger than anything the investigation began with. Something is beneath the Mesa. It is alive. It has been there across decades of documented phenomena that the people above it could not explain because they did not yet know what was generating them. Now they know. What Brandon Fugel does with that knowledge is the chapter everything before it was building toward.